Welcome to the Federalist Paper 51 class by the Grumpy Old Vet. This is Lesson 19 in this series. This lesson will cover Essay 51 of 85 essays, all written to the people of the state of New York, in counter to the arguments of the Anti-Federalists, to convince the people of the 13 states to ratify the Constitution. This essay was written by Hamilton and/or Madison, discussing that the external and internal controls in the Constitution are essential to keeping the separation of powers and checks and balances working. With that, let's move out. Welcome to the class, Federalist Paper 51, brought to you by the Hillsdale Justice Project at Liberty Hall, narrated by John Rutan. The structure of the government must furnish the proper checks and balance between the different departments. The Federalist number 51, 8 February 1788, written by Hamilton and/or Madison from the New York Packet, and as all 85 Federalist papers start out, to the people of the state of New York. To what expedient, then, shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution? The only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. Without presuming to undertake a full development of this important idea, I will hazard a few general observations, which may perhaps place it in a clearer light, and enable us to form a more correct judgment of the principles and structure of the government planned by the Convention. So what solution should we turn to in order to keep the power properly divided among the different branches of government, as the Constitution intends? The answer is that since the external measures aren't enough, the issue must be addressed by designing the internal structure of the government so that its various parts can, through their relationships with one another, help keep each branch in check. I won't try to explain this in full detail, but I'll offer a few general thoughts that might help clarify the idea and allow us to better understand the principles and structure of the government the Convention proposed. In order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own, and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. Were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistracies should be drawn from the same fountain of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. Perhaps such a plan of constructing the several departments would be less difficult in practice than it may in contemplation appear. To establish a proper separation of powers, which is widely recognized as essential for protecting liberty, it's clear that each branch of government should have its own independent will. This means that each branch should be set up so that its members have as little involvement as possible in choosing the members of the other branches. If this principle were strictly followed, it would mean that all appointments to the top positions in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches would come from the people, through separate processes that don't overlap with one another. While this might seem difficult at first, it could be more practical in reality than it initially appears. Some difficulties, however, and some additional expense would attend the execution of it. Some deviations, therefore, from the principle must be admitted. In the constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle. First, because peculiar qualifications being essential in the members, the primary consideration ought to be to select that mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. Secondly, because the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. However, there would be some challenges and additional costs in putting this idea into practice. Therefore, we must allow for some flexibility in following the principle. Specifically, when it comes to the judiciary, it might not be practical to strictly follow this principle. First, because the judges need special qualifications, The main priority should be to choose a method that ensures the selection of qualified individuals. Second, because judges hold their positions for life, they will eventually become independent of the authority that appointed them, reducing any sense of dependence on that authority. It is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others for the emoluments annexed to their offices. Were the executive magistrate or the judges not independent of the legislature in this particular, their independence in every other would be merely nominal. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for defense must, in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. It's also clear that the members of each department should be as independent as possible from the others, especially when it comes to the salaries and benefits tied to their positions. If the executive or the judges were not financially independent from the legislature, their independence in other matters would be meaningless. The key to preventing the powers of government from gradually becoming concentrated in one department is to give those who manage each department the necessary tools and personal incentives to resist encroachments from the others. Just like with any defense, the measures for protection must match the level of potential threat. Ambition must be used to check ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A person's interest must be tied to the constitutional rights of the position they hold. It may seem like a negative view of human nature that we need such measures to prevent government abuses, but the truth is, government itself is a reflection of human nature at its core. If people were angels, there would be no need for government, and if angels were the ones governing people, there would be no need for checks on their power. When creating a government run by people over other people, the biggest challenge is this. You have to first give the government the power to control the people, and then make sure the government controls itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. We see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. These inventions of prudence cannot be less requisite in the distribution of the supreme powers of the state. But it is not possible to give to each department an equal power of self-defense. Relying on the people is definitely the main way to control the government, but experience has shown that we also need additional safeguards. The idea of using opposing and competing interests to make up for a lack of better motives can be seen throughout all aspects of life, both private and public. This is especially true in how power is divided among different roles, where the goal is to organize things so that each position can act as a check on the others, and so that each person's private interests help protect the public good. These wise precautions are just as important when it comes to dividing up the highest powers of the state. However, it's not possible to give every department the same ability to defend itself. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches, and to render them, by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit. It may even be necessary to guard against dangerous encroachments by still further precautions. As the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided, the weakness of the executive may require, on the other hand, that it should be fortified. In a Republican government, the legislative branch tends to have more power. To address this issue, the solution is to split the legislature into different parts, making sure they are as independent as possible by using different methods of election and principles of operation, while still allowing them to perform their shared duties. It may also be necessary to take extra precautions to prevent overreach. While the legislative branch needs to be divided due to its significant power, the executive branch might need to be strengthened because of its relative weakness. An absolute negative on the legislature appears, at first view, to be the natural defense with which the executive magistrate should be armed. But perhaps it would be neither altogether safe nor alone sufficient. On ordinary occasions, it might not be exerted with the requisite firmness, and on extraordinary occasions, it might be perfidiously abused. May not this defect of an absolute negative be supplied by some qualified connection between this weaker department and the weaker branch of the stronger department, by which the latter may be led to support the constitutional rights of the former, without being too much detached from the rights of its own department? If the principles on which these observations are founded be just, as I persuade myself they are, and they be applied as a criterion to the several state constitutions and to the federal constitution, it will be found that if the latter does not perfectly correspond with them, the former are infinitely less able to bear such a test. At first, it seems like giving the executive branch a total veto over the legislature would be the best way to protect its authority. However, this might not be the safest or most effective solution. In normal situations, the executive might not use this veto power strongly enough, and in extreme situations, it could be misused. Instead of an absolute veto, could a weaker connection between the executive and the less powerful branch of the legislature help protect the executive's constitutional rights without separating it too much from its own responsibilities? If these ideas are correct, as I believe they are, and applied to both state and federal constitutions, it will be clear that the federal constitution comes much closer to meeting these standards than the state constitutions do. There are, moreover, two considerations particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place that system in a very interesting point of view. First, in a single republic, all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. There are two important points that make the American federal system unique. First, in a single republic, all the power given up by the people goes to one government, which prevents abuses of power by dividing that government into separate branches. In America's federal system, the power given up by the people is first split between two different governments, the federal government and the state governments, and then each of those governments is divided into separate branches as well. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other, at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Second, it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. If a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. This creates a double layer of protection for the people's rights. The different governments will keep each other in check, while also keeping themselves in check. Second, in a republic, it's not just important to protect society from the government's oppression, but also to protect one group of people from the injustice of another group. Different groups of citizens have different interests, and if the majority is united by a common interest, the rights of the minority could be at risk. There are but two methods of providing against this evil. the one by creating a will in the community independent of the majority, that is, of the society itself. The other, by comprehending in the society so many separate descriptions of citizens as will render an unjust combination of a majority of the whole very improbable, if not impracticable. The first method prevails in all governments possessing an hereditary or self-appointed authority. This, at best, is but a precarious security, because a power independent of the society may as well espouse the unjust views of the major as the rightful interests of the minor party, and may possibly be turned against both parties. The second method will be exemplified in the Federal Republic of the United States. Whilst all authority in it will be derived from and dependent on the society itself will be broken into so many parts, interests, and classes of citizens that the rights of individuals or of the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. There are two ways to protect against this problem. One is by creating a will in the community that is independent of the majority, meaning independent of the society itself. The other is by including so many different groups within society that a majority working together unfairly becomes very unlikely, if not impossible. The first method is used in governments with hereditary or self-appointed authority. However, this is not a very reliable solution, because a power separate from society could support the unjust views of the majority just as easily as it could support the rightful interests of the minority, and it could end up being used against both sides. The second method is demonstrated in the Federal Republic of the United States. In this system, all authority comes from and depends on society, but society is divided into so many different parts, interests, and groups that the rights of individuals or minorities are less likely to be harmed by the majority teaming up for unfair gain. In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects. The degree of security in both cases will depend on the number of interests and sects, and this may be presumed to depend on the extent of country and number of people comprehended under the same government. This view of the subject must particularly recommend a proper federal system to all the sincere and considerate friends of Republican government, since it shows that in exact proportion as the territory of the Union may be formed into more circumscribed confederacies, or states oppressive combinations of a majority will be facilitated. The best security, under the Republican forms, for the rights of every class of citizens will be diminished, and consequently, the stability and independence of some member of the government, the only other security, must be proportionately increased. In a free government, the protection of civil rights should be the same as the protection of religious rights. In both cases, security comes from having many different interests or groups. The level of security depends on how many interests or groups there are, and that number is usually influenced by the size of the country and the population. This idea should especially appeal to those who genuinely support Republican government, because it shows that if the territory of the Union is divided into smaller confederacies or states, it will be easier for a majority to oppress others. The best protection for the rights of every citizen under Republican government would be weakened, and the stability and independence of some part of the government would need to be increased to compensate. Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained, or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. In a society under the forms of which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may as truly be said to reign as in a state of nature, where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger, and as, in the latter state, even the stronger individuals are prompted, by the uncertainty of their condition, to submit to a government which may protect the weak as well as themselves. So, in the former state, will the more powerful factions or parties be gradually induced, by a like motive, to wish for a government which will protect all parties, the weaker as well as the more powerful. Justice is the ultimate goal of government and civil society. It has always been and will always be pursued, either until it is achieved or until liberty is lost in the pursuit. In a society where the stronger groups can easily come together and oppress the weaker ones, anarchy exists just as much as in a state of nature, where the weaker individual isn't protected from the stronger. In that natural state, even the stronger individuals eventually realize the need for a government that protects everyone, including the weak. Similarly, in a society where powerful factions dominate, those factions will eventually be motivated to seek a government that can protect all parties, both the weaker and the stronger. It can be little doubted that if the state of Rhode Island was separated from the Confederacy and left to itself, the insecurity of rights under the popular form of government within such narrow limits would be displayed by such reiterated oppressions of factious majorities that some power altogether independent of the people would soon be called for by the voice of the very factions whose misrule had proved the necessity of it. In the extended Republic of the United States, and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good, whilst there being thus less danger to a minor from the will of a major party, there must be less pretext also to provide for the security of the former, by introducing into the government a will not dependent on the latter, or, in other words, a will independent of the society itself. It is clear that if Rhode Island were separated from the Confederacy and left on its own, the lack of security for rights under a popular government within such a small area would lead to repeated oppression by majority factions. This would likely result in those same factions calling for a power completely independent of the people, because their misrule would show the need for it. In the larger Republic of the United States, with its wide variety of interests, parties, and groups, it would be much harder for a majority of the population to unite for anything other than justice and the common good. This means there is less risk for the minority from the will of the majority, and thus less reason to create a government with a will independent of the people, or outside the control of society. It is no less certain than it is important, notwithstanding the contrary opinions which have been entertained, that the larger the society, provided it lie within a practical sphere, the more duly capable it will be of self-government. And happily for the Republican cause, the practicable sphere may be carried to a very great extent by a judicious modification and mixture of the federal principle. Publius. It is just as certain as it is important, despite opposing views, that the larger the society, as long as it remains manageable, the more capable it will be of self-government. And luckily for the cause of a republic, this manageable size can be extended quite far with a wise use of the federal system. Publius. Summary. The key points in Federalist Paper 51 are: 1. Separation of powers. Madison argues that a key way to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful is by giving each branch its own distinct set of responsibilities and powers. The branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, must be separate and independent to preserve liberty and balance. 2. Checks and balances. Each branch must have mechanisms to check the power of the others. This interdependence ensures that no single branch can dominate the others. Ambition within each branch will serve to counterbalance the ambition of the others, which helps maintain equilibrium and prevents any branch from exceeding its limits. Internal controls. Internal controls refer to the built-in safeguards within the Constitution itself that ensure the proper functioning of the government. This includes the distribution of power. Madison emphasizes that the Constitution's design inherently divides power between different branches and between the federal government and the states, making sure that no single entity can seize all control. For example, members of each branch are chosen in different ways, e.g., members of the legislature are elected by the people, the president is elected through the Electoral College, and judges are appointed, ensuring they are not overly dependent on each other. checks within the branches. Each branch's authority is also constrained by the other branches. For instance, the president has veto power over legislation, but Congress can override that veto, and the judiciary can rule on the constitutionality of both executive actions and legislation. These internal checks are designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too dominant. External controls. External controls are those safeguards that come from outside the immediate structure of government, primarily through the influence and authority of the people and the laws. The people's influence. Madison stresses that the ultimate control over government comes from the people themselves. Elections, public opinion, and civic engagement allow the public to exert influence over the government. This external influence can force the government to remain accountable and responsive to the people's needs and concerns. The Constitution and laws, the written Constitution and the laws it establishes, serve as a second form of external control, setting the boundaries for government action. The Constitution outlines the powers of each branch, the limits of those powers, and the rights of the people, ensuring that the government cannot overstep its authority. The laws, in turn, act as practical guidelines for how the government must function and interact with citizens. Ambition, counteracting. Ambition. Madison famously writes that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This means that each branch of government, motivated by its own interests and authority, will naturally check the others. By designing the government in such a way that each branch has a stake in maintaining its own power, the system ensures that no one branch can dominate the others. Protection of minority rights. A crucial element of Madison's argument is that this system of checks and balances helps protect minority factions. In a large republic, it's less likely that a majority faction will be able to oppress a minority, as the diversity of interests and opinions creates multiple obstacles for any one faction seeking to dominate. Balance between power and liberty. The ultimate goal of the structure, Madison outlines, is to secure justice and protect liberty. A government needs sufficient power to maintain order and enforce laws, but it must also be restricted enough to prevent the abuse of that power. Both the internal and external controls work together to maintain this delicate balance. This concludes the 19th class in this series on Federalist Paper 51. I hope you found the information helpful and entertaining. I will see you in Class 20, where we will cover Madison's argument on the floor of the Congress, known as Bounty Payments for Cod Fisheries debate of 1792. This debate will mirror principles that Madison wrote about in Federalist Paper 41. Fall out.